Thank you, everyone. We're going to continue on with the program and having a robust and interesting conversation about how to use emerging technologies to support and build the vibrant digital economy that African countries need. And it's my honor right now to welcome to the stage our moderator for this conversation, Terry-Ann Chebet.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Terry-Ann Chebet. I'm the General Manager of a 24-hour business news channel in Kenya called Metropole TV, and I'm also a business journalist by training. I'd like to welcome you to this panel discussion that will focus on how emerging technologies can support a vibrant and secure digital economy. I'm excited to be here today because the country I come from, which is Kenya, has been one of the early adopters of digital technology, especially in the financial space. And a recent report by the Central Bank of Kenya showed that at least 82% of Kenyans today have financial inclusion. And most of them is through the mobile platforms. And of course, this has had a direct correlation with how businesses operate, how they sell, how businesses engage with people and the marketplace. My panel today consists of game changers, experts and business leaders who continue to lead the digital economy. And together they will paint us a picture of the current situation, the opportunities, the challenges, the low-hanging fruit, and of course we will open up the discussion to the floor for an interactive session that's just before we close the discussion. Help me welcome up on stage an all-woman panel, perhaps the first one I've seen since I've been here. Isabel Doshantos, the chair of Unitel. Let's give her a warm round of applause as she joins us on stage. Juliet Ehiwam, Director, West Africa at Google. Let's give her a warm round of applause. Charlene Vesmorter, Head of Philanthropy at Microsoft. Let's celebrate her. And Carole Wainaina, Chief Operating Officer at Africa50. Well, ladies, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here this morning. And we'll just get right into the conversation, which I'm sure is going to be quite exciting, because there's so much happening, within the digital space. And, they say the backbone of a digital economy is hyperconnectivity, between people, machines, businesses. So just as we kick off perhaps a quick round of formal statements, just so we know where you stand and as far as the digital economy is concerned, and then we'll take it from there. Carole, let's kick off with you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, so at Africa50, we deal with the infrastructure investments in Africa, and ICT is one of our big sectors. And I think where we uniquely play an important role is because we are a platform, we bring together the different players that are required in this infrastructure space. So we could go, and invest in broadband and data storage and all the things that sort of our mandate allows us to do, but we recognize that that's just one part of the solution. So what we're trying to do now is figure out ways to bring together the various players so that as we are doing one thing in one area, we are not sort of doing that independently of understanding the other parts of the value chain, including working with mobile companies, working with startups that are doing applications, and looking at networks as well. Mm-hmm. So I think we are funded by African governments, which allows us to have relationships with government to enable some of these things in the ground in a way that perhaps a purely commercial organization would not be able to do. So I think we are definitely not the tech people, but having funding from government and also from private sector allows us to bring the players together in a way that perhaps other organizations may not be able to.
All right, fantastic. And of course, the issue of a Pan-African digital strategy, comes to mind when you just say that. So it's something that I'd like to pick up later.
Sure.
Please.
So I personally believe that technology would play a very important role in transforming the continent and accelerating growth. I believe that Africa's biggest challenges will not be solved by traditional methods of the past. With developments like artificial intelligence and machine learning, for example, we're starting to see some transformational solutions. And at Google, we certainly believe that. And a lot of our efforts are really around working with different partners to help build the digital ecosystem, looking at different pillars that help to energize that digital value chain, from access to locally relevant content and to digital education.
Shirley?
So the mission of Microsoft is to empower every person and organization on the planet to achieve more. And at Microsoft, we're actually quite excited about the fourth industrial revolution because technology is absolutely at the heart of this revolution. We have seen in the past, all the revolutions have been, that there's been a rapid societal change, but never we've seen the rapid change of the fourth industrial revolution as we see currently. So at Microsoft, we see 4IR as an era of opportunity, and technology underpins the potential to drive Africa forward, enabling innovation and spurring new business models to drive economic growth. Our approach with digital transformation is built on 4 key pillars. The first one is to putting in world-class infrastructure to develop the necessary digital skills to drive innovation, and also then to build trust by policy development.
Isabel?
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's a real great pleasure to be here. It's my first time at AfricaCom, and I'd like to congratulate you for promoting this all-women's panel. So that is already transformative change in itself for Africa. I've been to so many of these conferences, and most of the time I'm actually the only girl, the only woman on the panel. So congratulations for promoting that and having women business leaders and women influential thinkers here sharing their view on how technology can really shape Africa. Now, I come from a mobile operating company, so we were established about 20 years ago. And one of the things we did that was very different, radically different, is to believe that Africa is beyond mobile. So it would not only be about talking, it would not only be about voice, but really would be about building this incredible infrastructure of fiber optical cables that would be able to deliver data at a high speed, because we believe that data can really change business. Now, I'd like to think that investors and people, they put money where they can make money. And the big question today is, how can African businesses, how can small producers, local farmers, how can they make money? How can they make business of the technology change? And that will really be transformative.
Absolutely. All right, let's get into the conversation around infrastructure. And I'd like a few comments from all of you, because the backbone, first of all, is the infrastructure. How do we get that right? In a number of African countries, and Kenya has been mentioned quite a bit. Of course, I'm biased, but it has been mentioned quite a bit in terms of development of infrastructure, especially on the digital and mobile wallet space. What sort of infrastructure should we look at to leapfrog into where Africa needs to go? Carole?
Yeah. So I think we still need to take a two-pronged approach, because, and a few of the speakers have talked about the fact that there's a lot of investment, obviously, in broadband and allowing access to connectivity, which must continue. At Africa50, we are able to work with governments who are in a PPP format, where they are struggling perhaps with the investments required to build these broadband. So we're in discussions with a number of countries now with a PPP framework, because we have the right vehicle to attract the international investors who want to make money by helping do that. But on the other hand, we also recognize that that's going to be a slow process, particularly for the rural and underserved areas. So we recently launched an innovation challenge where we are crowdsourcing solutions that might be working somewhere else, or haven't quite been developed, or a number of solutions that can be brought together. We have an organization that can do the early stage development, the later stage financing as well, which means that particularly those areas where people are looking for projects that can be brought to bankability and potentially scaled in Africa, we are very happy to play that role. So within our innovation challenge, once we get those solutions, we will be able to work with the various winners to be able to finance them and also help scale. We have a country that's agreed to pilot it, so we're going to work with Rwanda, and we recognize that the solutions will probably be cobbled between an infrastructure element, probably network, probably mobile, and applications as well using startups. But we can bring all of those together. We are funded by 28 countries. We have very good relationships with those 28 countries, so the idea is that we can also help to scale. So in addition to helping with the hardcore infrastructure, and of course there's many companies already investing in that, helping with that last mile connectivity with an affordable, accessible, modular solution, I think is one of the areas we want to try and help facilitate.
Juliet, I'd like to rope you in on the issue of scale. You know, across the African continent, we're seeing a lot of tech hubs where, you know, entrepreneurs are really doing big things, but the issue of scale, you know, is still a problem. What are your thoughts around that?
I think you make a very good point. In a continent where you have 1.2 billion people, if one is not careful, your effort can be likened to a drop in the ocean. And we see a lot of initiatives, but there is a real challenge around scale. And I think it's important to think about that early on in design. And I would approach the issue of scale from, I would say, 3 perspectives. The first is just how do we scale existing initiatives, and then also how do we create scale around the rate of development, the rate of innovation, right? In terms of existing initiatives, I think, you know, for one thing, we know that Africa is a mobile first, in some cases mobile only region. And so it's important, you know, the mobile phone is a device that most people have access to. And so it's important for solutions to be mobile compatible, right? And also thinking about leveraging communities, right, to scale. So one of the things that we're doing in the area of digital literacy is providing digital skills training to 10 million people in 5 years. Now, how we're scaling that is working through partners across multiple countries in Africa, empowering them and equipping them with the content and tools to be able to roll out this training at scale. In addition, we're training 200,000 developers, and again, to really you know, spread the word, to create scale, we're leveraging communities of learning. So, you know, powering the Andela learning community, partnering with organizations like Pluralsight and Udacity, and leveraging communities like Google developer groups. We have 130 Google developer groups at the moment in 32 countries across Africa. For the developer skills training as well, we have 100 developer student clubs. So I think it's just really important to leverage communities, to leverage partnerships as well, to be able to go further. Now, still on existing initiatives, what we'll find on the continent is a lot of organizations are doing some really great stuff, right? But there is an opportunity for us to be more intentional about really coming together and pulling some of those initiatives and resources together to achieve scale. Because at the end of the day, you know, one can say that there's a lot of focus on you know, a very small pie. Right now we have 22% connectivity on the continent, about 20% of people online. Those are really small numbers, right? So rather than just trying to optimize the existing pie, which is important, we can probably come together more to expand the pie, right? So that there's a lot more engagement, there's a lot more activity and all that. And that way we raise the digital game, raise the level of contribution of the digital economy, and everybody wins. Mm-hmm. So that's in terms of existing initiatives. But I think also in terms of the rate of innovation, one reality in our region is just survival, right? The need to earn a living, especially when you think about the unemployment rates. And so innovating around business models, if we think about some of the innovations that are starting to emerge and that are possible, there are some where the business model is very clear. So for example, fintech, right? We had 300% increase in investment to startups last year in sub-Saharan Africa, and 40% of that was for fintech startups. Now, I mean, there's an opportunity around financial inclusion for the unbanked, but it's also quite possible that because the business model is very clear, you know, it's a percentage of transactions, right? But what about other areas where solutions are important? So for example, in parts of Africa like Tanzania, we have examples of machine learning being used in agriculture, right, for remote diagnosis of diseases of cassava crops. And that's been very effective. Now, a particular example was funded by a research institute, right, and then made available for free to farmers who would not be able to afford this technology otherwise. Now, if you take out that research institute and you're thinking about startups, developer communities, who funds this innovation, right? And so it's important to start to think about innovating business models. Perhaps organizations can start to see development of the digital ecosystem and these initiatives as part of their CSR investment, right? So an organization that uses cassava produce as part of its raw materials could perhaps work with the developers in this way to create solutions that innovate in that space. So I think the reality around monetization is something that would fuel the rate of innovation, because when people see an opportunity to earn an income, they really go the extra mile to make things happen.
Absolutely. Charlene, that brings you right into the picture. Juliet has mentioned intentionality and the need for organizations to think about the social impact as well, in the spirit of leaving no man behind. What are some of the things that can be done? Because if you look at the African picture, even when we say, for instance, in Kenya, mobile penetration is at 80% or 92%, most of it is in the urban areas and not the rural areas. So how do we engage more and bring everybody, into a similar platform?
Yes, I think, at Microsoft we've got various programs especially that we take into the society, into the communities, to help empower them that they can use technology more effectively. So the first thing that we do is we've got Cloud for Good, where we donate software to NGOs and NPOs that they can then deploy technology to help them to improve the way that they work, and to have, especially if they say have to send out their field workers, that they can have direct communication with them. So we empower NGOs to also digitally transform by giving them workshops, by donating these software at a highly discounted rate. We also have an AI for Good grant, and that grant is for organizations, it's also for NGOs, individuals, that can apply to address and the challenges that we have around our society and our environment today. We've got 4 pillars that you can actually go and apply for grants. It is AI for Earth, AI for accessibility, AI for humanitarian aid, and then the last one is for heritage. The one that I also just want to mention, that we have for AI for Earth is also focusing on the area of agriculture, on conservation. In South Africa, we've got a very good story about the Peace Park Foundation that actually used AI to help with rhino poaching. So those are some of the examples on how we can take those solutions, to areas where it's so much needed. And then we've also got Airband, where we use TV white spaces to help with connectivity in rural areas, because that is always a big issue, that if we want to go to communities, to the rural areas, and we expose them to technology, is that they don't have the infrastructure and they don't have the connectivity. And then lastly, I think the biggest thing that Microsoft invested in South Africa to help with making cloud services more accessible and cheaper is our data centers that we've based in Johannesburg and Cape Town. And because we know cloud services is really at the foundation of digital transformation. And, an example is that an SME making use of some of the cloud services to develop their tools and innovation, they don't need the huge investment in the infrastructure anymore, to develop their solution, because the cloud services make it more affordable to them. So I think those are some of the examples that we implement in Microsoft to help to make technology and infrastructure more accessible to those that don't have.
All right. Thank you, Charlene. Isabel, how do we build businesses for tomorrow? One of the questions as journalists we ask about in Kenya not to offend my fellow Kenyans because we've done incredibly well, is how do we build an M-Pesa, for instance, for tomorrow? We still celebrate M-Pesa, but it's 10 years or just over 10 years down the line. But how do we build, there's an innovation challenge every other month across, the continent. But how do we build this young innovators beyond the pitch, beyond the innovation challenges into Facebook, into solutions that will create innovations that will solve Africa's problems?
I guess we're all looking for Africa's unicorn, and who's going to be the next African champion. And you're absolutely right. I mean, this is the key. How do we transform our traditional economies into a digital economy? And the first thing will be is, what is a digital economy? Because for a lot of us, we're not quite certain of what that actually means. Does it mean that all of a sudden we have to start digitalizing the processes in our companies? Does it mean that everything will be digital? But then that's really the key issue, is, as Juliet said, is the training and understanding of what technology can do for you as an opportunity for your business. And when I talk about business, I don't only want to think of urban areas and established, financial centers, but also whether this digital economy can actually help change small businesses, local producers, farms, farming communities. So one of the big issues that we really have, and I like to go back to it, is infrastructure. Because if we really want to have digital change in Africa without infrastructure, there's going to be a problem. And Africa is still lagging behind in infrastructure development in a big, big way. For example, at Unitel in Angola, we have built over 14,000 kilometers of fiber optical network. So we've connected all the cities. We've also made metro links. And we started very early on, around 2005, 2006. It took us nearly 15 years, and we were lucky because we were in a buoyant economy. Our economy was growing. We could actually finance that development. But I know that for a lot of regions in Africa, that's not the case. So the challenge will be, how do you put the right infrastructure for digital change? The second issue is really people and skills. How do you get those skills? And Juliet was very right. I mean, training people, having companies like Google, like Microsoft, very involved in getting those skills to people is really going to be a difference. And then the business model. What can you do? And when you think of the business model, I mean, I was looking at something very easy on the internet about a girl that's studying at a university in Africa and needs to buy a management book. Now, before, she would probably have to send some money to a person who's a friend of hers living overseas, doing the traditional money transfer, asking to go to a bookstore, get her that management book. Today, she doesn't need to do so. She can go online, find the book, make a digital payment, download the book, and be able to study immediately. So that's one way, really, e-commerce and digital economy is changing. Now, can we translate that to our products, to our reality, to things we make? Can we make our products something that's available on e-commerce? Because one great opportunity we'll have is that trade barriers are going down in a way. We're able to communicate our products better to a much, much wider audience. And also that means that the costs of selling those products will go down because the margins of actually selling the products are coming down through digital platforms. So how do we take advantage of that? So I see that the next big companies in Africa will really be driven a lot by this digital economy of e-commerce and trade.
Mm-hmm. Your point about people reminds me of a conversation I recently had about the future of work. And is Africa, equipping and creating digital skills within its people to be ready for, for the future of work? And I'll keep this open to, whoever wants to take this question. How do we prepare our young people to be ready for tomorrow? I've seen, projections saying 40% of the jobs that exist today will not exist in the next 10 years. Are we ready?
So I would like to comment on that, and I think this is really where collaboration needs to come in. So we need to collaborate with the Department of Education. We need to collaborate with tertiary institutions. We need to collaborate with communities where we can expose the kids to train them on digital skills. I think that is definitely the biggest, one of the biggest focus as my role as a philanthropist leader at Microsoft is to see how can we ensure that the kids are trained on digital skills, that we can prepare them for the world of work and for future skills. But that is through partnerships. It is impossible to achieve that on your own. And I think it is to work with, like government to help drive policy change, to start including, digital skills training like coding in schools. I know our department, our Minister of Education announced last year in South Africa that they're going to start including coding into schools from next year. But I think, there's much more needed to do to ensure that the kids are trained for the future jobs, which some of us don't even know what those jobs are, but that you give them the skills that is needed. We did research through the IDC, and some of the top skills that they say employers would need within the next 5 years were not all the technical skills. It was skills like collaboration, innovation, problem solving. So I think we need to entrench into the kids, not only training them on digital skills, but also those skills that they would need to help them to be more employable for the future.
Isabel, I saw you smiling. Would you like
Yes,
to chip in?
I did, because I was actually thinking of what you were saying, and then I remembered an example of karité butter. So it's that butter that's fantastic for wrinkles. And I met this entrepreneur, this business, and I'm sad to say that he was actually American and not African, but he did something very smart. He went to different countries in Africa. They were actually producing cocoa butter, and spoke to small farmers and producers and put them all on a digital platform. And then through that digital platform, he is now selling those products, rebranding them and selling them in America at a very, very successful rate. It has become a multi-million-dollar business now. So this is really the opportunity we have. So of course we're thinking of jobs of tomorrow, the coding and so on, but we also need to think of the jobs of today. This is the big challenge. Our populations are growing, for example, in my country, about 3.5% a year. That's like 1 million babies every year. That's a lot of babies. And we need to think about how do we get jobs for the parents of those babies today as well. Because if the parents don't have enough income, there is no way they're going to provide the right level of care, nourishment, and education. So the first thing for me is really how do we solve some of the issues we have now using the digital economy that's available to us right now at this moment.
All right. Juliet?
I do agree with what's been said. I think it's important to introduce digital tools and platforms and the digital skills early, because we have a lot of, and I think everyone would agree, we have a lot of talent across Africa, and people just need exposure. When they're introduced to the tools, etc., they do amazing things. For example, we have a case of two brothers in Nigeria, 9 and 11 respectively, that developed a web browser, right? They were able to do this because they were introduced to systems and software early on. And so I think that's really important. And one of the things, in addition to digital skills training that I mentioned, one of the things we've done recently is collaborate with the Ministry of Education in Nigeria to introduce computer safety concepts into the curriculum. And that way being able to reach 50 million users as part of a core part of their training. I think introducing STEM subjects, giving students an opportunity to try their hands around coding, building solutions and all of that. I think that's really important so that we can really unlock the talent and the potential that exists.
All right. The ITU recently, put out a statement and said for Africa's digital economy to work, first of all, the public sector, that's the ministers of ICT or IT in all the African countries, need to work together to put together a real focused strategy on Africa's digital economy. And Carole, I'm just curious about how, you've been in that space already. What are some of the biggest challenges that stakeholders face in building a common goal or working towards a common goal? And what are some of the things that can be done to streamline the process?
Yeah. Well, I think there has been a lot of probably more talk and discussion than actual action about trying to have a Pan-African digital strategy and agenda. And in the last few years, perhaps there's more hope than we have seen in the past, because at least the ICT ministers are talking. We have Smart Africa and organizations such as that are bringing groups together. So I think in the last few years, we've seen much more of these platforms where the discussions are happening, projects are starting to happen on a small basis. But I don't think the African heads of states at the highest level have decided that we can connect our 54 non-viable chunks into something really powerful if we just had came together on trying to optimize our digital connectivity and interoperability, so that everybody isn't trying to lay their own expensive broadband networks and internet access country by country, and making sure that costs across are harmonized. But at least we're seeing a lot of work in that area. Mm-hmm. I think there's still a lot that can be done, and then the question is now, how do we bring in the private sector? The private sector will invest where they make a return. And so creating more opportunities where we can have the right vehicles for de-risked projects, where these infrastructure investments are actually returning a return to investors, will bring in more money into the continent to start to do some of that investment that is so much needed. Because although we are seeing quite an increase, the big tech companies are also taking big bets on that, because they know that the digital economy will grow even if the connectivity isn't there today. So we hope that one of the things we can do, because we represent multiple countries, but we are a commercial company, we're actually probably the only private sector, the only Pan-African institution where African governments give us money as investors. So they give us their money, but they don't tell us how to spend it. And then in terms of access to our investments, we have an independent investment committee, so we can make decisions really quickly compared to an IFC or an African Development Bank or some of the other IFIs that are also working in this space. Mm-hmm. So hopefully we can also catalyze some of those Pan-African projects where we do have sufficient support to start working across 2 or 3 countries. Mm-hmm. And we're doing that in other infrastructure areas, including power, which of course is much needed also for IT infrastructure. And we hope that we can also find some projects in the ICT space that can help do projects across multiple countries, so that we're not trying to do one country at a time. But I'm hopeful. I think there are a number of things happening in the continent, the Africa Free Trade Area, that is starting to give us hope in this area. We're starting to see projects like the KIC in Rwanda that we are also actively participating in. So when we see a country that's serious about something and they're one of our shareholders and we can invest and bring the other partners together, bring all the other funders together, we play a very critical role. So the Kigali Innovation City, for example, is bringing together the talent, the capital, and the technology. And in that city, they will have both the universities, the tech organizations, but of course, they also need the business ecosystem to be able to make sure that that is thriving. Mm-hmm. So we're very much involved in helping them develop that and the master plan. And of course, we come with money, so the fact that we've already co-invested makes it easier for the other people to come forward, because we've done the early stage, which is the hard part that no one wants to invest in.
All right, given the fast pace of development within Africa's tech space, the issue of regulation also comes in. But it's such a thin line, and we constantly have that conversation around how much regulation is good regulation, especially in such an innovative space. Juliet?
So I think for sure government plays a very important role in creating an enabling environment for investment in technology infrastructure. And you mentioned public-private collaborations earlier. I think those are critical, because the regulation, the policies need to be informed by the needs of users and the needs of private players within the sector. So for example, the development of the National Broadband Plan in Nigeria was a public-private collaboration exercise. We were part of that. A number of private sector organizations as well as government agencies were part of the committee that put that together. And that helped to surface some of the key issues within the industry. So for example, things like right-of-way issues, the high cost of obtaining right-of-way, double taxation from the federal and state governments, destruction of cable infrastructure during road constructions and building constructions, the fact that there was very little infrastructure sharing, and so everyone was almost vertically integrating along the value chain. And then when you think about challenges around power, etc., and the fact that you have to provide alternative power for your base stations, the costs really piled up, right? And then those costs get passed on to the users. So having that dialogue helped to surface those issues as a critical part of the next steps for trying to drive more broadband infrastructure growth. So I think that dialogue, the public-private collaboration is really important in surfacing those issues. And across Africa, one of the things that we do is really just engage with governments in a proactive way and in a consistent way.
All right. Isabel and Charlene, I'd like you to respond to the question on PPPs. One of the panels I was part of yesterday, one of the gentlemen said, our problem is that we are not doing PPPs as we should. Whether it's from a policy side, whether it's from investment side, how can we, as players in the tech space, engage better with governments? Both of you could respond to that.
Can I go first?
Yes, sure.
Okay. So I think that's an excellent question, because our population today in Africa is about 1.2 billion people. And by 2050, we're going to be 2.4 billion people, so more than China. And when we look at the numbers that we need to invest in infrastructure, we're talking trillions, 435 trillion. That's huge. That's a massive number. And the commitment that has been done so far by African governments and public money is about 10-20% of that. So where is the rest going to come from? And you mentioned energy, and energy is a real concern. We're all looking at 5G, and we know that without energy, you cannot have 5G. That's just not going to happen. So we're saying we're going to be delivering 5G networks into Africa, but can we deliver 5G network in an area that has no electricity? Not likely. So this is a big, big challenge. And that's where the private and public partnership can really make a difference. Now, from my experience, what I find is that most governments are not yet as business savvy as they should be when it comes to public-private enterprise. Because you're absolutely right. Business is driven by profit and by making money. It doesn't mean that you don't have a sustainable business model. For example, through Unitel, in 20 years, we have invested through private money over $2.2 billion in fiber optical cables with no government money, with no subsidies. So it is possible. If you have a good enough market, if you have a good relationship with government, you can invest and you can commit to invest. But you need certain things. You need security, in contractual security. You need to understand and to be able to foresee what your market is going to be like. And that today is a little bit, I think, the challenges for PPPs is really the uncertainty. The uncertainty because these are long-term commitments for the private investors. Mm-hmm. So if governments can work around that and create business models, a little bit like the vision that you mentioned there was a master plan. So documents like master plans for cities, for example, understanding demographic growth, where new jobs going to come from, where are going to be the development sectors, all of that creates a positive environment for private investors to come in and invest.
All right.
So one thing that I can mention, in South Africa, they established a public-private inclusive growth committee that is actually looking at different streams on how we can address the challenges in South Africa, especially the high unemployment rate. For those of you that don't know, South Africa's unemployment rate is the highest in the world under the youth. So that committee is really driving the public-private partnership and to see how we can be inclusive and how we can address the issues that we faced with in South Africa. The other thing that Microsoft has done is we established a policy innovation center in Pretoria at the University of Pretoria, where we engage, we have stakeholder engagements where we address things like the responsible use of AI. really the burning issues all around the 4IR, where we invite then, government, the public and the private people to come and engage and to have this engagement to see how we can address these very burning issues in the country. Mm-hmm. So those are two of the things that I can say, we are, the way that we encourage more, the public and private partnerships to help to implement change and that we can see this transformation.
Julianne, if I could just add, one of the things I'd really like to see happen is in the energy sector, the same thing that happened in the telecom sector. Because in the telecom sector, we saw a lot of private investment come in and really change telecom for Africa. And I hope that the next step is going to be investment to come in and for the energy sector to change in Africa.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open up to one or two questions before we come back to my panel for a final round of comments. And then we close this session. Do we have any questions from the floor? Yes, we do. I think there's a microphone coming down. Please keep our questions as short as possible. Please identify yourself and who you'd like to give your question to.
Thank you. My name is Antonio Nunes. My question is to Carole. So I would like to understand the following. As we said, and you have been saying, and very well, business is driven by profit. Okay? Why are we still financing governments and not enterprises or entrepreneurs?
Please.
Yeah. Actually, Africa50 only finances private projects and public-private partnerships. So what we have is government money that's funding private and public-private partnerships. So we are to catalyze investments through private sponsors, because if they invest with Africa50, the projects are sufficiently de-risked because there is already some government partnership or government investment in that project. So you can go to a minister and say, why are you getting in the way of your own investment if you're already a stakeholder in this? So the idea was to create a vehicle where you had both the financing of government and private sector. But with anything to do with infrastructure, you always have to deal with government, and it's one of the biggest barriers. In our innovation challenge, for example, we are going to be financing entrepreneurs using government money, but through a vehicle that is fully commercial. We also, because we do very early stage development and are able to bring projects to bankability, which is the big issue is who is going to invest in these early stages so that, if it's an entrepreneur, they can find financing. Most of this early stage work has very little takers. So Africa50 is willing to do that because we have government funding, but we do it in a very commercial way. So I think your answer is, it feels like we are investing. Yes, if it's a big PPP, it's going to enable everybody in that country. So if a country wants to get in their broadband network, they don't have the money. They're willing to do it in a version of a PPP where there can be revenue and there can be a de-risk project for private sector. We then go and help structure that project. But we are only a strategic minority, and we bring in all the other investors and all the other players. But we see ourselves very much about catalyzing the private sector versus necessarily the public sector. But in some of these big infrastructure pieces, you have to have both. And the PPP format, I think, works in many of those places because you do need the government enablement.
Right. Yeah. Do we have any more questions? None. Looks like my panel was absolutely brilliant. You have answered all the questions in advance. All right, help me. Oh, no. Before we wind up, some final comments from all of you, perhaps just looking forward into Africa in the next 5-10 years. How are we seeing that space from the perspective of our digital economies? Let's start with you, Isabel.
Well, I see the rise of African champions. I think that we are going to have some big companies in the digital space, in the digital economies. We still don't have the Alibaba of Africa. We still don't have the Amazon of Africa. And so that's a massive opportunity. E-commerce is a huge opportunity for us. If we look at Singles Day in China, just on one day, they traded over $12 billion. Now, can you imagine what that could do in our trade in Africa? So I think that really for the next 10 years, there's going to be some amazing African champions that will rise up.
All right. Charlie?
Yes, I totally agree. I've got a lot of hope for this continent. I think there's so much potential. There's so much potential for growth. And I think, with conventions like this, for me, the most important is that we really need to learn from one another because, we are all countries faced with many similar kind of issues. And I think if we can learn from one another and how we can address some of the issues that's relevant in our country with some of the solutions that they've already implemented in other countries, we can really scale and show impact much quicker by sharing knowledge and experience with one another.
Julia?
I think we're already seeing talent and technology coming together to create amazing solutions. And as I mentioned at the start, I think technology really offers an opportunity to accelerate addressing our issues in Africa in a more cost-effective way and in an accelerated manner. And we're seeing year-on-year growth in terms of activities online, the growth of startups. But I think it can be faster. So my hope is that all players in the ecosystem would really come together and see how we can be intentional about accelerating that growth, because I think it would really speak a lot to accelerating the transformation on the continent.
Carole?
Yeah, no, I'm just really excited, and I think we've had lots of examples of what's happening on the continent with our young people and all the various technological innovations that are helping solve our social problems. I guess I'm excited that we're not going to do it the old way. We need to do it the new way, and with solutions that are more designed for what we need. However, as I think everybody else has said, we need to bring the talent, the capital, and the technology together in ways that work. And everyone talks about finding ways to do that. And we've seen examples today of how people are coming together, whether it's Ericsson and one university to do digital skills. There's lots of partnerships going forward, but we're not scaling fast enough. So let's find each other, and I think we also need the collaboration to be not just finding each other to do a business, but at the business model point where we are forced to actually play together. So these platforms like Africa50, the business model itself is actually to enable collaboration, because we have no choice. We have to play with others. But we have capital, and we can help bring the other players together. We have African governments who are all, we don't have all at the moment as shareholders, but we have 28. We're trying to get all 54. But because we are hardwired to play at a Pan-African level, it makes it easier for us to help with scale, help with investments, and help bring the partners together. But I'm pretty sure there are many other ways that we could do that. But I'd like to see much more business model innovation that forces the collaboration we need to bring these things together and create a place where not just the business people make money, but our entrepreneurs also make money and scale. Yeah.
Well, with that, we come to the end of this panel discussion. Join me in thanking my panel, Isabel dos Santos, Chair Unitel.
Thank you.
Charlene Vesmota, Head of Philanthropy in Microsoft. Juliet Ehimwan, Director, West Africa, Google. And my name is Terry Anchebet. It's been an absolute pleasure to be part of this conversation. Thank you very much. Okay. He'd like a picture.